The wagon wheel didn't just break, it exploded. One moment, Nora Carter was rocking along a dusty trail in the middle of God's own nowhere. The next, a crack like a gunshot ripped through the air. The wagon lurched violently, and she was thrown against the side rail, the wood digging into her ribs. The driver, a man with a face like dried leather, didn't just curse. He went dead silent. His eyes darted left, then right, not at the broken axle, but into the endless empty plains around them. He leaped from his seat without a word, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of a knife she hadn't noticed tucked in his belt. He left her there, alone, stranded on a broken-down wagon miles from a town she'd never seen, with nothing but a satchel, a prayer, and a letter from a man she was supposed to marry tomorrow. The letter was simple. Henry Albright was a practical man. He had a ranch, 2 kids, and no time for romance. She'd read the words until they were burned into her mind. "I'll have the preacher ready the day you arrive." It wasn't a proposal, it was a transaction. And now, with the sun beating down and the driver circling the wagon like a wolf, she realized she'd paid a price she couldn't yet understand. The driver came back, his face grim. "Axle's shot," he grunted, but his eyes weren't on the wheel. They were on her. "We'll have to walk." He didn't offer to help her down. He didn't offer to carry her bag. He just started walking, leading the limping horse, and Nora had no choice but to follow, her boots sinking into the fine Wyoming dust. Each step felt heavier than the last. She'd left Indiana because the factories stole the breath from your lungs and the hope from your heart. She'd come west for a chance, any chance, to build something. But as they crested the last rise and the tiny crooked shape of Windmere came into view, a cold dread washed over her. It wasn't a town, it was a collection of shacks huddled together, as if for protection. And waiting on the porch of the only real building, the livery, was a man. Broad-shouldered, sun-scorched, arms crossed over his chest. That had to be Henry Albright. But as he saw her approach, his face didn't show relief, or curiosity, or even a simple welcome. It showed nothing. A hard, blank wall. "You Nora Carter?" he asked, his voice flat as the prairie. "Yes, sir." He didn't offer a hand. He didn't smile. He just grunted and turned his back to her. "Come on, then. Stew's on." And as Nora followed this stranger, she was meant to call husband, she noticed something that made the hair on her arms stand up. Every window she passed had a face in it, watching, not with the simple curiosity of a small town, but with a hard, hungry stillness. They weren't just looking at her, they were measuring her. The Albright house was solid but grim, built from rough-hewn pine that seemed to soak up the sunlight and give nothing back. Inside, it smelled of boiled meat and something else, something vaguely medicinal and sour. 2 children sat at a plain wooden table, their eyes enormous in their small faces. A girl, maybe 6, with tangled blonde hair, and a little boy who clutched a spoon so tight his knuckles were white. "This is Miss Carter," Henry announced to the room. The children didn't speak. They just stared. The silence in that room was louder than any factory floor. They ate the stew without a word, the only sounds the scrape of spoons and the frantic ticking of a clock on the mantel. Finally, Nora couldn't take it anymore. "Mr. Albright," she began, her voice sounding foreign and frail. "Your letter implied we would be married tomorrow." He didn't look up from his bowl. "That's the arrangement." "An arrangement? You speak of it like a business deal." He finally met her eyes, and they were cold as river stones. "Isn't it? You needed a place. I needed a wife." "A place isn't a person," she whispered, her hands trembling. "And I am not an animal you can purchase." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed his face. Not anger, fear. "My first wife. She died 2 winters ago. My daughter needs a woman's hand." The little girl, Rachel, flinched at the mention of her mother. The boy, Eli, just stared at his bowl. "And what do I need, Mr. Albright?" Nora asked, her voice gaining strength. "Did that thought ever cross your mind?" "You answered the letter." That was it. That was all that mattered. The transaction was complete in his eyes. Nora stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floorboards. "I won't marry you," she said, the words ringing in the suffocating silence. "Not tomorrow. Not ever." Rachel's jaw dropped. Eli finally looked up, his eyes wide with a terror that seemed far too old for his face. Henry stood slowly, his shadow swallowing the room. "You'd rather go back to nothing?" "I'd rather sleep in a ditch under an open sky," she said, her voice shaking but clear, "than in a cage with a man who doesn't see me." He took a step toward her, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You can't just say no." But she was already moving, pushing past him out the door and into the twilight. She didn't look back. She walked through the single dusty street of Windermere, past the silent, watching windows, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have a penny to her name. All she had was the defiant, terrifying freedom of her own refusal. She found an abandoned caretaker's shed behind the town's bell-less church. It was little more than a box of rotting wood, but it was a place to hide. As she huddled in the darkness, pulling her thin shawl around her shoulders, she heard footsteps outside. Not the heavy tread of Henry Albright. These were lighter, a woman. The door creaked open, and a tall, wiry figure stood silhouetted against the moonlight. It was the widow, Jean Lovett, a woman whose eyes seemed to see everything in town. "Well," Jean said, her voice like gravel, "you made your choice. Now you get to see what it costs." She stepped inside, and in her hand she held a lantern. But behind her, blocking the doorway, stood two of the town's men, their faces grim and unreadable in the flickering light. Nora's blood ran cold. This wasn't a rescue. It was a warning. Jean Lovett set the lantern down on a dusty crate. The light carved sharp shadows across her face, making her look more like a hawk than a woman. "You've caused a stir, Miss Carter," she said, her voice deceptively calm. "Henry Albright is a good man, a provider." Nora stood her ground, her back pressed against the cold wood of the shed. "A provider who thinks a wife is something to be ordered like a sack of flour." Jean's thin lips tightened. "This is a hard place. We don't have time for poetry and romance. We have time for survival. You made a promise when you stepped on that train. I made an agreement based on a letter. I did not sign away my soul." The two men in the doorway shifted, their presence a silent threat. Jean ignored them. She took a step closer, her sharp eyes scanning Nora from head to toe. "You've got grit. I'll give you that. Most girls would have been weeping in their stew." She paused. "But grit doesn't put a roof over your head or bread in your belly." Jean then did something unexpected. She gestured for the men to leave. They hesitated, then obeyed, melting back into the darkness. "They were just making sure you didn't run off in the night," Jean said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Wouldn't be the first time." The words hung in the air. The first time. "What do you mean?" Nora asked. Jean shrugged, her gaze distant. "This land swallows people, especially women who don't know the rules." She then placed a bundle on the floor, bread, a small jar of beans, and a bar of soap. "You'll need your strength. The town council will meet in the morning to decide what to do with you." Nora stared at her. "The council? To decide my fate? I've broken no law." "You broke a contract," Jean said flatly. "In Windermere. That's the only law that matters." And then she was gone, leaving Nora alone in the flickering lantern light, the food a strange mix of charity and threat. The town wasn't just disappointed in her. They were judging her. And her trial was tomorrow. The next morning, a cold wind swept through the cracks in the shed. Nora hadn't slept. She'd spent the night replaying every moment, every cold stare, every veiled warning. This wasn't just about a failed marriage arrangement. This was about control. She ate the bread Jean had left, the dry crumbs catching in her throat. Around mid-morning, just as her anxiety was reaching a fever pitch, a small figure appeared at the edge of the churchyard. It was Rachel, Henry's daughter. The girl darted from tree to tree, looking over her shoulder as if she were being followed. She clutched something in her hand. Nora stepped out of the shed. "Rachel, are you all right?" The girl ran the last few feet and shoved a small folded piece of paper into Nora's hand. Her eyes were wide with fear. "Mama left it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He doesn't know I have it." Before Nora could ask what she meant, a sharp whistle cut through the air. Henry was standing at the edge of his property, his face a thundercloud. "Rachel, get back here, now!" The girl flinched as if struck and ran back toward the house without another word. Nora looked down at the paper in her hand. It was brittle, worn, soft, with countless foldings. She carefully opened it. It wasn't a letter, it was a drawing. It was a crude map of the ranch, with a large X marked over a spot near the creek, far behind the barn. And beneath the X, a single word was scrawled in a shaky, feminine hand. "Run." The drawing felt like a ghost's touch in her hand. Run. The word screamed at her from the brittle paper. This wasn't advice. It was a desperate plea from the woman who came before her, the woman who had died of a winter sickness. Nora quickly hid the map in the lining of her satchel. The town council, she knew, was a farce. They weren't going to offer her a train ticket home. They were going to make sure she stayed. She had to find out what was at that X. Jean Lovett found her an hour later. "The council is ready for you," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. They met in the back room of the general store. It was just 3 men, the store owner, the blacksmith, and Henry Albright. They sat behind a large table like judges, their faces hard and unforgiving. "Miss Carter," the store owner began, "you have broken your agreement with Mr. Albright. This community cannot abide by such instability." "I am not a horse you can trade back if you find it unsuitable," Nora said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. The blacksmith slammed his fist on the table. "You will show respect. You came here to be a wife. You will be a wife." Henry said nothing. He just sat there, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on a spot on the wall behind her. He wouldn't even look at her. "You have 2 choices," the store owner continued. "You marry Henry Albright tomorrow as planned. Or you work off the cost of your passage. The debt will be held by the town." Nora's stomach dropped. "Work? Doing what?" "Whatever we need," the blacksmith said with a cruel smile. "Mending, cleaning, cooking. There's always work." It was indentured servitude, a prison without bars. They were going to own her, one way or another. She looked at Henry, a silent appeal in her eyes. "Help me?" He finally met her gaze, and what she saw there wasn't cruelty. It was a deep, soul-crushing despair. He was as much a prisoner as she was. "I'll need the day to consider," Nora said, forcing the words out. The men exchanged glances. "Fine," the store owner said. "One day. But don't even think about leaving Windmere. The road only goes one way out here." That night, under the sliver of a new moon, Nora slipped out of the caretaker's shed. She had to get to that creek. The map was her only hope. The air was cold and still. Every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot. She crept through the back of the town, staying in the shadows, her heart in her throat. The Albright ranch was dark, the house a sleeping giant against the starry sky. She circled wide around it, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement. She found the creek easily, its gentle burble a stark contrast to the frantic beating of her own heart. She followed its winding path, moving deeper into the woods behind the property, her hands outstretched to feel for branches in the near-total darkness. She found the spot marked on the map, a small clearing dominated by a cluster of fallen birch trees, their white bark glowing faintly in the moonlight. She knelt, her fingers frantically searching the cold, damp earth. What was she even looking for? A box? A buried letter? Her hand brushed against something hard and metallic. A handle. It was an old ammunition box, buried just a few inches below the surface. With trembling hands, she pulled it free. It was heavy. She pried open the rusted latch. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, was a small leather-bound diary, Martha Albright's diary. Nora opened it to the first page, her eyes straining to read the elegant script in the faint moonlight. October 12th. I am not his wife. I am his replacement. He did not tell me about the first one, the one who disappeared. He says she ran away, but the women in town, they watch me. They whisper. They say the ground here is hungry. Nora's breath hitched. A first one? Before Martha? Suddenly, a floorboard creaked behind her. She whirled around, the diary clutched to her chest. Henry Albright stood at the edge of the clearing, a lantern in his hand, his face a mask of shock and fury. "What are you doing?" he snarled. "Give me that!" He lunged for the diary, but Nora scrambled back, holding it out of his reach. "Who was she?" Nora demanded, her voice rising. "Who was the woman before Martha?" Henry froze. The fury in his eyes was replaced by a raw, primal fear. He looked like a man staring into his own grave. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, the words barely audible. And from the woods behind him, 2 more lanterns flickered to life. The blacksmith and the store owner stepped into the clearing, their faces grim. They had followed him. Or perhaps they had all come together. Nora was trapped. She looked from their hard faces to the diary in her hands, and she finally understood. This town didn't just swallow women, it buried them. "You've been snooping where you don't belong," the blacksmith said, his voice a low growl. He took a menacing step forward. Henry didn't move. He just stared at the diary in Nora's hands, his face pale in the lantern light. "Stay back," Nora warned, her voice trembling but defiant. She held the diary up. "Martha's words are in here. What really happened to her?" The store owner chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "That little book? It's just the ravings of a hysterical woman. She was ill, confused." "She was scared," Nora shot back. "Scared of all of you. Scared of what you did to the woman before her." The men exchanged a dark look. They weren't just here to intimidate her anymore. She knew too much. Henry finally spoke, his voice strained. "Give them the book, Nora. It's for the best." "The best for who, Henry?" she cried. "For you? For them? What about for Martha?" She clutched the diary tighter. It was her only weapon, and her only shield. Seeing that she wouldn't give it up, the blacksmith moved. He was surprisingly fast for a man his size. He lunged, grabbing her arm. Nora screamed and twisted away, but his grip was like iron. She swung the heavy ammunition box with her free hand, catching him squarely in the side of the head. He grunted in pain and stumbled back, giving her the opening she needed. She ran. She plunged into the dark woods, branches clawing at her face and clothes, the men's angry shouts echoing behind her. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she had to get away from the creek, away from the ranch. Adrenaline surged through her. She ran harder than she'd ever run in her life, her lungs burning, tears of terror streaming down her face. She could hear them crashing through the undergrowth behind her, their lanterns swinging wildly. They were gaining on her. The woods ended abruptly at the edge of a steep ravine. She skidded to a halt, loose rocks clattering down into the darkness below. It was a dead end. She was trapped. "Nowhere left to run, little bird," the blacksmith called out, his voice laced with triumph. He and the store owner emerged from the trees, their faces demonic in the swaying lantern light. They had her cornered. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked down at the diary, then at the dark chasm below. There was no escape. But as the men advanced, a third figure appeared. Henry. He pushed past the other two men, his face a mess of conflict and anguish. "This has gone far enough," he said, his voice shaking. "Let her go." "She knows, Henry," the store owner said, his tone icy. "She knows everything. She can't be allowed to leave." "She's not like Martha," Henry pleaded. "She's different." "That's what you said about the last one," the blacksmith sneered. Henry flinched as if he'd been slapped. He looked at Nora, his eyes begging her to understand. But understand what? That he was a victim? Or a monster? Nora didn't wait to find out. While they were distracted, she took her chance. She wasn't going over the edge, but she wasn't going to be captured either. She scrambled sideways along the narrow ledge, her fingers desperately searching for handholds in the crumbling rock face. A root, a jutting stone, anything. The men shouted, caught off guard. She moved faster, the diary still clutched in one hand. She found a narrow game trail, barely a foot wide, winding down the side of the ravine. Without a second thought, she took it. She half ran, half slid down the steep incline, dirt and rocks cascading around her. She didn't dare look back. She reached the bottom of the ravine, her ankles screaming in protest, and kept running, following the dry creek bed that snaked through the canyon floor. She didn't stop until the shouts faded behind her, and the only sound was her own ragged breathing. She was alive. She was free. But she was lost in the Wyoming wilderness, with a dead woman's diary and a town full of secrets hunting her. She collapsed behind a large boulder, shaking uncontrollably. She opened the diary again, her hands filthy and scratched. She had to know the whole story. She flipped through the pages, past entries about loneliness and fear, until she found what she was looking for. A page near the end, the handwriting frantic and spidery. "His name is not Henry Albright. It's a lie, like everything else in this town. His real name is Harrison Blackwood. He came here after the war, a wanted man. The town gave him a new life, a new name, in exchange for his silence. He knows what they do here. He knows about the silver." Silver. Nora's mind reeled. What did silver have to do with anything? She read on, her blood turning to ice. "The mine is their secret, their god. They lure women out here not for wives, but for sacrifices. They believe the land demands a price for its riches, a woman's life for a vein of silver. The first one, Agnes, they threw her in the old shaft, I think. I think that's where they're going to put me." Nora felt sick. This wasn't a town. It was a cult. A bloodthirsty, silver-worshipping cult. And Henry, or Harrison, was one of them. He wasn't just a grieving widower. He was a killer. Suddenly, a twig snapped nearby. Nora froze, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure was standing at the edge of the creek bed, not 20 feet away. It wasn't Henry or the others. It was Jean Lovett. She held an old, rust-pitted rifle in her hands, and it was aimed directly at Nora's chest. "You should have taken the deal, child," Jean said, her voice colder than a winter grave. "Some secrets are worth dying for." Jean Lovett walked slowly toward her, the rifle held steady in her weathered hands. "That book has caused more trouble than a fox in a henhouse," she said, her eyes fixed on the diary. "Martha was a fool. She never understood. This place gives us everything. A home, protection, wealth. All it asks for is a little faith." "You call this faith?" Nora whispered, her voice hoarse. "You call murder faith?" "I call it a necessary sacrifice," Jean corrected her, her voice ringing with the conviction of a zealot. "The earth gives, and the earth takes. We simply honor the arrangement. An arrangement Jedediah, our founder, made with this land a long time ago." Nora's mind was racing. Jean was the leader, the high priestess of this twisted religion. The men were just her enforcers. "Henry knows," Nora stated, watching Jean's face for a reaction. "He's part of it." Jean's lips curved into a semblance of a smile. Henry is a broken man who was given a second chance. He does what he's told. He brought Martha here. He brought you here. His debt to this town is one he can never repay. The pieces clicked into place. Henry wasn't just a member. He was their Judas goat, luring women to their deaths to pay for his own sanctuary. The cold, practical man in the letter was a lie, a carefully constructed mask to hide the monster beneath. "Now, give me the diary," Jane commanded, raising the rifle slightly. Nora looked down at the book, then back at the cold, hard eyes of the woman who was about to kill her. She had one last, desperate card to play. "No," Nora said. Jean's finger tightened on the trigger. "This isn't a negotiation." "You can shoot me," Nora said, her voice surprisingly calm. "But this diary isn't the only proof. Martha was clever. She sent letters." It was a complete bluff, a wild shot in the dark, but it was all she had. Jean's eyes narrowed. "Liar." "Am I?" Nora pressed on, her confidence growing. "She wrote to her family, about the mine, about the disappearances, about a man named Harrison Blackwood. Those letters are on a train heading east right now. If I die, they'll be opened. The whole world will know what you are." For the first time, Jean hesitated. The conviction in her eyes wavered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. It was the opening Nora needed. In one fluid motion, she threw the diary into the shallow creek, sending a spray of water and mud into the air. As Jean instinctively flinched, Nora scrambled up the rocky bank on the other side of the creek bed. A shot rang out, the bullet whining past her ear and chipping stone just inches from her head. She didn't look back. She ran, fueled by pure terror, pushing her body past the point of exhaustion. She burst from the ravine and found herself on the open prairie. In the distance, she saw the faint lights of a wagon trail. A real one. The main route. If she could just reach it. She ran, stumbling over sagebrush, her lungs on fire. She could hear Jean behind her, crashing through the brush, shouting her name. But Nora was smaller, faster. She was running for her life. The gap between them widened. Just as she thought she might make it, her foot caught in a rabbit hole. She went down hard, her ankle twisting with a sickening pop. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up her leg. She tried to stand, but the ankle wouldn't hold her weight. She collapsed back to the ground, sobbing in frustration and pain. It was over. Jean would be on her in seconds. She looked up and saw headlights. Not lanterns, headlights. A motor car, a rare and miraculous sight, was bouncing along the distant trail. It was her only chance. Ignoring the agony in her ankle, she began to crawl. She dragged herself through the dirt and thorns, her nails breaking, her hands raw. Every foot was a victory, every yard a miracle. She could hear Jean getting closer. "It's no use, girl. There's nowhere to hide out here." But Nora didn't stop. She crawled faster, pulling herself forward with a strength she never knew she possessed. The car was getting closer. She could hear the rumble of its engine. She raised her head and screamed, a raw, desperate cry for help that tore from her throat. The car slowed. It was turning off the trail, heading toward her. Hope, fierce and blinding, surged through her. At that moment, Jean burst from the brush, her face contorted with rage. She raised the rifle for a final point-blank shot. But before she could fire, a man's voice yelled, "Drop it! Now!" A man in a long, dusty coat stood by the motor car, a pistol in his hand. Jean froze, caught in the glare of the headlights. The man walked forward, his steps sure and steady. As he got closer, Nora saw his face. It was the man from the stagecoach, Marcus Vane, her brother-in-law, or so she had thought. "Fancy meeting you here, Miss Carter," he said, his eyes not leaving Jean. "Looks like you've stirred up the hornet's nest." Jean stared at him, then at Nora, her mind working furiously. "Who are you?" "The name's Vane," he said calmly. "Pinkerton Detective Agency. I was hired by the Albright family to find their missing daughter, Martha. Everything crashed down on Nora at once. The lies, the secrets, the murders. Marcus wasn't a vulture from her past. He was a lifeline. Jean, realizing the game was up, made a desperate move. She swung the rifle toward Marcus, but he was faster. His pistol barked once, the sound deafening in the night. Jean crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across her chest. Marcus rushed to Nora's side. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Nora could only nod, tears of relief and pain tracking paths through the dirt on her face. As Marcus helped her to her feet, another figure emerged from the darkness. Henry. He stood there, unarmed, his face a hollow mask of defeat. He looked at Jean's body, then at Nora, his eyes filled with a bottomless shame. "It's over," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank God. It's over." Marcus leveled his pistol at him. "Don't move, Blackwood." Henry didn't even flinch. He just looked at Nora. "I never wanted this," he said, his voice breaking. "I tried to protect her, Martha. I tried to get her out, but Jean. She controls everything. Everyone. I couldn't fight her." "You could have tried," Nora said, her voice cold. "You could have warned me. And they would have put me in the ground right next to you," he said, raw honesty in his voice. "I was a coward. I chose my children over a stranger. I'm sorry." The apology hung in the cold night air, thin and useless against the weight of his sins. He had been a prisoner, yes, but he had also been a jailer. He had made his choices, and now the reckoning had come. Behind him, the flicker of torches appeared, snaking their way from the direction of Windermere. The town was coming. The townsfolk arrived not as a lynch mob, but as a dazed and broken congregation. They saw Jean's body, the Pinkerton agent with his gun, and the truth began to dawn on their faces. The spell was broken. With their high priestess dead, the fanatical certainty that had held Windermere in its grip for decades crumbled into dust. The blacksmith and the store owner were with them. When they saw Marcus, they tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. They surrendered without a fight, their blustering rage replaced by a pathetic, whimpering fear. They had been followers, not leaders, and without Jean's iron will, they were nothing. Marcus Vane was methodical. He rounded up the ringleaders, his authority absolute. He had sent a wire before ever coming to Windermere, and he knew a U.S. Marshal was already on his way from Cheyenne. Justice was no longer a local affair. Henry or Harrison Blackwood didn't resist. He sat on the ground, his head in his hands, as his children, Rachel and Eli, were brought to him. They ran into his arms, their small bodies shaking with sobs. They didn't understand what was happening, only that their world had been torn apart. Nora watched them, a storm of emotions churning inside her. He was a monster, a conspirator to murder. But he was also a father who loved his children. The two things didn't cancel each other out. They just existed together, a terrible, messy truth. The next day, the marshal arrived with a posse of deputies. The town of Windermere was officially under federal investigation. They found the mine, just as Martha's diary described. And in the dark, forgotten shafts, they found the bones. Agnes, Martha, and at least 3 other women whose names were lost to time, each one a sacrifice to a god of greed and silver. The story came out in pieces. Jedediah, the founder, had discovered the silver but knew a rush would destroy his vision of a perfect, isolated community. So he invented a religion, a blood pact with the land, to keep the secret and the silver for his chosen few. Jean Lovett, his direct descendant, had carried on the tradition with a terrifying piety. The men followed her out of fear and greed, and the women they lured west. They were just fuel for the fire. Henry's story was the most tragic. He truly had been a wanted man, a deserter from the war who had stumbled upon Windermere by accident. Jean offered him a sanctuary and a new identity in exchange for his service. His first task was to marry Agnes, the previous mail-order bride, and keep her compliant. But Agnes was strong-willed. She discovered the secret and tried to expose them. So they silenced her. They forced Henry to watch. They made him complicit. When they ordered him to write for a new bride, he was a broken man. He married Martha, hoping he could somehow protect her, but he was too deep in their web, too afraid for his own life and the lives of his children. He had tried to help Martha escape, but Jean caught them. The winter sickness had been a slow, deliberate poisoning. Nora had been his last chance at a twisted sort of redemption. He had hoped her strength could somehow break the cycle he was too weak to break himself. He had underestimated both her and the evil he was serving. The trial was held in Cheyenne. The blacksmith and the store owner pointed fingers at everyone but themselves and were sentenced to hang. Harrison Blackwood, for his cooperation and the clear evidence of his coercion, was given a life sentence in federal prison. He asked to see Nora one last time before he was taken away. She met him in a small, barred room. He looked older, his face etched with a grief that would never leave him. "They're with a good family now," he said, speaking of his children. "The marshal found their mother's sister back east. They'll be safe." "I'm glad," Nora said quietly. "I never meant for any of this to happen to you," he said, his eyes pleading with her. "I saw something in your letter, a strength Martha had. I hoped you could win." "You hoped I could fight the battle you were too afraid to fight yourself," she finished for him. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I am a coward. I know that. But I am grateful, Nora. You freed my children. You freed me. Even if I spend the rest of my life in this cell, I'm free from Windermere." Nora left without another word. There was nothing left to say. She returned to Windermere a few weeks later. The town was a ghost of its former self. Many families had packed up and left, shamed by the revelations. The ones who remained were quiet, their eyes holding the haunted look of people who had woken from a long and terrible dream. The government had seized the mine. The silver that had cost so many lives was now just another federal asset. Nora went back to the small caretaker's cottage. She packed her few belongings, her hands moving with a slow, deliberate purpose. She had faced down death, uncovered a vast evil, and brought justice to the forgotten. But she had no home. As she was about to leave, a wagon pulled up. It was Marcus Vane. "I thought I might find you here," he said, tipping his hat. "Where will you go now?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Back east, I suppose. Find work in a factory again." Marcus shook his head. "A woman like you doesn't belong on a factory floor. You were meant for more than that." He reached into his coat. "The Albright family, Martha's family, they were very grateful. They wanted you to have this." He handed her a thick envelope. Inside was a bank draft for a substantial amount of money, a reward, and a deed. The deed to the Albright Ranch. "They have no use for it," Marcus explained. "They said the woman who avenged their daughter should be the one to decide its fate." Nora stared at the papers, her mind numb. The ranch, the house of horrors. But it was also just land that had seen too much sorrow, but land that could perhaps be healed, just like the town, just like her. She looked up from the deed at the vast open sky of Wyoming. It didn't look menacing anymore. It looked like a promise, a blank page. "What will you do?" Marcus asked gently. Nora took a deep breath, the clean, sage-scented air filling her lungs. "I think," she said, a small, slow smile spreading across her face, "I'll stay. I think I'll build something." The story of Nora Carter could have ended there, with justice served and a new life beginning. But the deepest secrets of Windermere weren't buried in the mine. They were buried in the bloodlines. And a new evil was already on its way, drawn by the power vacuum Jean Lovett had left behind. What Nora had uncovered was only the first layer. If you enjoyed this story of courage and uncovering dark truths, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of the strange and the mysterious. You never know what secrets the next story will hold.